Hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker.
And I'm Amy Therese, and this is What's Left.
So today on What's Left, we're going to do the thing that we hinted at doing at the end of last week's episode and talk about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and some of the reservations which Amy and I have about her as a political actor. And we're going to start with an example of something that AOC said a couple months back that I found a little bit strange. So a couple months ago, AOC said, we have to have respect for children, respect for families, respect for human rights, and respect for the right of human mobility. Because it is a right. It is a right. Because we are standing on native land, and Latino people are descendants of native people. And we cannot be told and criminalized simply for our identity or our status, period. I thought that was really incoherent. Amy, did you think that was incoherent?
I mean, I've had, sometimes I get a little bit pedantic in terms of the way people use terms like legal terms, as though they're just these free-floating signifiers that have no content, right? So a concept like a, quote, right is in fact something that has a whole lot of implications embedded within it. So in order for something to be a right, it implies some form of institutional apparatus through which that right can be vindicated. It implies, at a bare minimum, another party with a duty. In order for there to be, for you to have a political claim, there needs to be somebody else who has a duty to fulfill that claim. They have an obligation towards you as a rights holder. Now, I mean, just insisting that something is a right might be a useful strategy in some useful rhetorical strategy. I personally, I'm enough of a pedant that I find it too annoying regardless. But I can see some value in, for instance, someone like Bernie Sanders and whomever else is advocating it in these terms, saying that something to the effect of, healthcare is a human right or should be a human right.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. The issue is
but what she's making is
it's not a coherent claim.
But that's when you assess it as a political claim or a legal claim. But she's making it as a moral signifier because I don't think she has a very coherent set of theoretical underpinnings.
Well, so she starts with a normative claim, right? That we have to have respect for human rights and respect for the right of human mobility. And she means this in a normative sense, that we ought to have these rights. The thing is that that's universal language. Human rights, the right of human mobility, that's universal human rights, humanistic language. But then she says that the reason that these are rights is because we are standing on native land and Latino people are descendants of native people. So she takes a claim that's universal to do with being human, and then she tries to justify it on the basis of something particular, native land and Latino people being the descendants of native people. And I thought that was really weird because, for one, the left has been defending birthright citizenship, which alleges that your political status as an American stems from having been born in American territory. And Trump wants to change that and make American citizenship something you inherit by blood, like they do in Europe. But here, AOC is not defending citizenship rights as something to do with being born on the territory. She's making a blood argument that because Latino people are descendants of Native people, that they can't be in any way constrained by immigration law or can't be denied citizenship on the basis of birthright, which is just an incoherent argument, which would undermine birthright citizenship by making it into a blood-based thing. And then, secondly, Native Americans don't believe that Native American political status is something you can inherit by blood. They think that Native American status is a political status that has to be conferred by a particular tribe. So in asserting that Native political status is the political that being a Native American is what gives you a right of human mobility, she's not only contravening birthright citizenship, she's also contravening Native Americans' own self-conceptions of what's required to have Native American identity. Being Latino doesn't mean that you've got tribal citizenship, and so it doesn't entitle you to claim Native American political status. And by switching back and forth between that unifying human rights language and that particularist language that confers special status on particular groups, she just shows that she has a very inconsistent view on citizenship, on group status, group rights, on immigration. It doesn't make any sense. It's a really, really stupid thing to say.
Sorry. Dear listener, my favorite thing about Benjamin is his endless and very endearing capacity to and insistence upon shoring up people's arguments to like the most robust version of them possible. And I really think like that's worth doing. But I also think that like that series of absurd contradictions and inconsistencies and complete resounding incoherence is consummately neoliberal. It's the race reductionist logic of our time, and it is necessarily incoherent. And I think like I almost feel like we make a category error by like trying to figure out like where she's coming from in a really robust sense, because I don't think that any of this stuff is in any way like I just think she's just a funhouse mirror of everything that's around her. Like it's not. I think it's unprincipled.
Yeah, and I end up having to come to that conclusion too. I tried to find, when I first read this, and I wrote a blog post about it back in February, I tried to find some kind of way to make sense of this. I tried to find some kind of coherent set of core beliefs that AOC has that she's operationalizing in some way.
And even
I
if you
just
could
can't find that.
Yeah, and what I think you try to do, and I admire it, and I do the same thing, even though I seem kind of bombastic, it's only because I've sort of done what you're doing in kind of like I do it in a reductionist manner in my head first, but like you actually do the painstaking work of like assuming a particular set of principles and then perhaps, observing like outlier occasions where she may have diverged from them, or like what is it that she's doing here that perhaps looks like it might be in fact antithetical to, this other set of consistent principles that she ordinarily has, right? Like how is it that she went astray here? Or what is it that's like making her a little bit like incoherent on this position? It's like, I think that ultimately, if you keep doing that, you just end up tying yourself in knots, because at a certain point, you just have to bite the bullet and recognize that she is the perfect, like she really is the perfect, quote, millennial politician. And I don't say that out of any kind of like a millennial identity, but more that like people of our age have come up in a world that is just totally unyieldingly neoliberal. And even when it attempts to vocally and aesthetically disavow neoliberalism, then quite often that's when it is in fact like neoliberalism at its most insidious, because usually when people are doing that, they're selling you something. And that like anti-neoliberalism is in fact just neoliberalism repackaging itself as anti-neoliberalism trademark.
But before you hear someone talk a whole lot, everybody says that she's a socialist, she's the new voice for democratic socialism. Oh, and look, and she beat this centrist Democrat. And you want to believe it. You want to believe that the left is making real inroads. You want to think that these people aren't just using the word in a mistaken or diversionary kind of way. But then they say things that make you realize that there's just no clear set of principles or clear set of thinking underlying their thought. You can't go from we've got a human right to mobility to Latinos have got a right to mobility because they're descended from Native Americans. You can't switch back and forth in that way. You can't claim to care about how groups conceptualize themselves and then trade on Native American identity like it's a blood inheritable thing. It's the same mistake Elizabeth Warren made. And because Ocasio-Cortez is Latina, in claiming this, she's claiming to be Native American the same way that Elizabeth Warren claimed to be Native American, on the basis of blood without a tribal identity.
Yes, because
and this is something that nobody talked about at the time.
Because it's unmoored.
And I only saw conservative outlets discuss it at the time. I didn't see anybody on the left even take notice of this. And to me, it was just a shockingly, well, you and me, but not anybody else.
Yeah, because we're all liberals now. So the conservatives say it's not you're not playing consistently on your own terms. And the liberals say you're not deferring to Native Americans. And the only people who I think are saying what is in any way fucking relevant and what can in any way get us out of this pernicious identitarian bind is someone who is willing and able to say, I reject this whole thing on its face because my political principles actually contradict both the notion of sequestered ethnic sovereignty separate and apart from the political community that exists otherwise, and I reject the notion of authority on the basis of bloodlines and standpoint epistemology, and I reject the notion of a racialized identity being something that we want to politicize for a leftist politics. Like, there's no one prepared to reject all of it, in addition to identifying the fact that it's not being, like, they're not playing the game on their own purported terms, and it's a shitty game anyway.
Well, and this is not the first time that you and I talked about issues with AOC and this sense that AOC doesn't have a clear or coherent set of principles. We've had this conversation a number of points over the last few months, and for a long time I was reluctant initially to really decidedly bail on her. I thought maybe she had gotten mixed up about a couple of things. Maybe she was, she just misspoke. Everybody has a bad day. But these things have been stacking. So it wasn't just this. Last summer, there was the episode where Ben Shapiro asked her to debate him. And her response was, Just like catcalling, I don't owe a response to unsolicited requests from men with bad intentions. And also like catcalling, for some reason they feel entitled to one. Another tweet that I just thought was really messed up on several levels, because one, she had challenged her debate opponent, her primary opponent during the race to a debate. And when he declined to debate, she tweeted, "My opponent seems to be avoiding a debate and isn't acknowledging me. It's just the two of us. So weekend, I stopped by his office, said hello, and asked for a debate in person." So if you're going to say that challenging someone to a debate is like catcalling them, and then you yourself challenge someone to a debate and came to where they work to personally challenge them, if that was a genuine analogy, then what you're saying is that you yourself previously in the past committed catcalling and then some form of stalking.
I think that a triangulating liberal, and in fact, even I myself, I can see where you're coming from, but I would actually push back against that. I don't think that's the best argument in response to what she said, because I think she could very plausibly say, this was my Democratic opponent in an electoral competition. I think that the citizens have a right to expect their representatives to articulate their vision for the electorate. And
of course, I'm not saying that she has to debate Ben Shapiro.
Bear with me. That's
not what I'm saying.
Bear with me a moment. All I'm saying is she could triangulate her way out of that ostensible criticism by making some sort of argument to the effect of why she thought this was for the greater good, and because it was contextually different in terms of the importance for the public, in terms of his existing responsibility as an incumbent, right? I think you could make an argument that a large number, especially of liberals, would buy that argument, that would attempt to draw a distinction there, especially because it's very easy to hate a sniveling little fucking baby like Ben Shapiro. And so I think what you actually need to do is make a far more, I think, inarguable claim. And that is quite simply, I'm a congresswoman. I'm not in the practice of debating internet personalities. If anyone wants to reach out, speak to my comms team.
Yeah, and I would have said, why even bother replying to it? If you're going to reply, that's how you reply. And what do you even need to reply? He's not a politician. He's not.
Oh, I'll tell you why you need to reply.
If he's not entitled to a response, don't give him one.
You need to get what you do need to give him one, but what you do is you literally get a member of your comms team to reply with some kind of very generic, requests for communication with Ms. Cortez can be made to person X at place X. Thank you. Behalf of,
regardless of whether you make some kind of generic response or you don't respond, the one thing that you have
to respond to neutralize the problem is he has enough of an online audience full of people who are invested in any form of drama, right? And so it's going to blow up into a very stupid talking point if you don't neutralize it.
But these are people that she doesn't need, and this happened after the race was over.
Hang on.
It doesn't matter to her politically.
No, but she's not solely a political actor within a vacuum. She's a political actor within a milieu, and you do to some degree need to be a brand manager, right? So what you need to do is be a professional, be an adult, and have a third party respond to it, or even respond to it yourself and say, communicate with my comms team, reach out to X.
Either way, though, I think it's a red herring.
To neutralize it so it's over.
Sure, but it's a red herring. It's beside the point. The issue, the reason I'm raising this is that she didn't do a non-response or some kind of generic response, or just point out that he's not a politician and therefore not someone who has standing to debate her. She has to turn it into him catcalling her. She has to accuse him of catcalling in the response.
Yeah,
which is just straightforwardly not accurate and makes her look much worse. If you think that Shapiro's entitled to some kind of response, that's a response that feeds Shapiro.
Hang on a sec. Hold up. So the problem is, I think your frame just there disavows half of the viewing public, but then also disavows another half. So, like, you're simply saying you don't need him and you don't need his people, but you're also not factoring in the people who are not his people. Do you get what I'm saying? Or I'm being too oblique. The point is, that type of lean-in liberalism nonsense, that type of, performative contradiction, that type of, like, pretending to be the vulnerable woman who's also got her ass-kicking boots on to march all over the patriarchy is literally, like, that is the epitome of, like, female neoliberal subjectivity. Like, that's literally what it is. And so she endeared herself to the whole, like, the entire PMC contingent of the Democratic Party.
You see how you flipped here, because initially you said, oh, she needs to make some kind of generic response because Shapiro's got a big audience and Shapiro's audience needs to be engaged. And so she needs to make some kind of acceptable professional response to that. That's what you said initially. And now you're saying not only does she not need to make a professional response that treats them like they're serious people, but she instead should make a response which doesn't treat them like they're serious people, mocks them in a way which will antagonize them and which they will see as an admitted win.
Wait.
And so instead of saying that...
Hold up. No, hang on. I'm saying what she is doing endears her to a contingency of sorts in ways that I would utterly reject. But it's not nothing. Like, she gained something out of that, out of what she did, right? It's not just
but she loses more than she gains, doesn't she?
I agree, absolutely. But what I'm saying is the calculation for her is very different than the calculation that people like you or I make. So if you're a leftist, you're looking at, like, the materiality of what is happening across the board. If you're a consummately neoliberal subject for whom the bounds of terrain are binary and they exist in this opposition where the furthest right you can be is the fringes of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party is the good party and they're ostensibly on the left, despite, the occasional Joe Manchin. They're the party of leftists. And that breadth is the extent of political availability. Then endearing yourself to what is utterly hegemonic among your milieu of the good people and alienating the bad people, that has a particular type of, like, signifier value to you within the milieu in which you operate.
But at this cost, that what you're doing in doing that is that you are alienating yourself from the vast bulk of people who are not going to think that someone challenging you to a debate is catcalling. The vast majority of people aren't going to think that. And so what you're doing is you're making a small group of base people who live in Brooklyn happy, while at the same time, in the long run, diminishing your political utility to everybody else outside that tiny base. And maybe all AOC intends to do is stay a representative for a strange Brooklyn district with a strange electorate and cater to their tastes for the rest of her career. But a lot of people, and AOC herself, when she was going to Michigan and going to Kansas and campaigning for left-wing primary challengers, a lot of people thought that AOC was trying to build some kind of national movement rather than just her own brand. And so what I find aggravating about this is that it's evidence that she's not interested in building a national movement. She's going to say things that appeal only to a very, very, very narrow base. And she's going to use that to promote herself and promote her brand with that base at the cost of not just her own ability to influence politics across the country, but insofar as the right is able to associate democratic socialism with her, she's going to damage other people who use that name and that label through that kind of behavior.
Yeah, she's a fucking liability for the left. I don't want to for a second pretend anything other than that. But what I'm saying is, I think we make a fundamental mistake when we assess her as though she's a left-wing actor operating through like a socialist analysis. She's a liberal. She's the vanguard of the Democratic Party.
But let me walk the audience through the stages of the actions that she's taken, which demonstrate this, right? So first we have what she said about immigration and the human right to mobility, which showed a level of incoherence which indicates that she isn't really sure where she stands on anything and will use sloppy language that sounds nice but is full of internal contradictions. Now we've got a case where she is going to pander to a narrow base at the expense of her overall national popularity and therefore of the overall national popularity of democratic socialism insofar as in people's minds she's associated with it. Now, on top of this, I also want to talk a little bit about the Green New Deal, because the Green New Deal is something she proposed primarily to get attention and to promote herself as a climate change crusader. But it's a piece of legislation which had absolutely no chance of passing, and which, if it were passed, would not resolve the climate change problem because it would not be in any way remotely radical enough to resolve it. Nonetheless, she spent a lot of time talking about that, and now she says that it's a success because she's raised the profile of the issue and people now list it as a higher priority issue than they used to list it. That's what she said on Twitter. So she conceptualizes her influence and her promoting left-wing causes not through her ability to accomplish anything in a material sense, but through her ability to promote certain kinds of language in the discourse.
I think part of the problem is I use terms that like they have so much embedded within them, but I don't think people realize what I mean. And so when sorry, I'm just trying to rewind myself. When I say she's like a consummately neoliberal millennial, literally what I mean is like she's huffing her own farts on social media. She thinks that politics is about Overton window shifting and discourse and memes and like that getting people to like talk about something more, to make something trend is to do politics. Like, sorry, I get really tongue-tied because I don't even know where to begin. And so I just find myself like repeating things she said as though they're like self-evident when they're not.
And people on climate, I think a lot of people on the issue of climate change don't understand how deep a hole we as a species and the planet is on that issue.
I want to say a couple of things. First off, I think it is a totally mistaken frame to imply that expertise and intelligence and thinking the right things about the science is what is any form of roadblock to change. Those are not the structural factors inhibiting change. We've already had the expertise lined up with this for decades. We've already had a significant enough proportion of the public for there to be a form of banal democratic mandate for action of one kind or another, right? The issue with this is one of vested interests within capitalism. And so by framing this as solely an issue that requires us to get enough people to have the conversation is to totally misunderstand what's going on here. Like Princeton did a study over a decade ago suggesting that at least since the 80s, the early 80s, there's a 95% correlation between political preferences of corporations and their fulfillment. And the exact opposite is true in terms of public support for policies and their instantiation.
But let's not even pretend that people know what Green New Deal is when they vote in those polls, because they don't, because the content of it is incredibly vague, because it's a series of targets without any real explicit legislation for how to meet those targets. It's a set of guidelines divorced from all meaning. And beyond that, there's a much deeper problem, which is that even if the United States were able to completely cut its emissions to zero, this is now an irreducibly global problem. Other states around the world are industrializing rapidly and increasing their emissions rapidly. India increased its emissions by almost 7% in 1 year after the Paris Climate Agreement was signed. And India was a signatory on that. And that means that India's increase in emissions wiped out all of the reductions made in the entire developed world. And so when you've got a problem like that that's irreducibly global, you cannot pretend that that is solvable at the domestic level. That's not a realistic approach. And what is going on around the world on climate is that individual politicians, parties, and governments are pretending that they can solve this issue and that they take it seriously to get votes. But none of them actually have a plan to solve it, because any kind of plan that would actually solve it would involve some kind of international political order revision. You would need some kind of constructed global institutions of some kind to enforce real, meaningful, legally binding, aggressively pursued targets. And we've never had anything like that, because what we instead get at the international level are treaties that require you to make action plans that many states aren't able to fulfill anyway. And you have a state like Canada that every time they make one of these action plans going back to the early 90s, they not only fail to cut emissions to the level that they predict, but oftentimes the level of CO2 stays the same or increases after they sign one of these deals. And the reason that they sign the deal is to create a perception for the public that they're doing something about climate change. And there are a lot of politicians on the left who are interested in creating a perception that they're interested in doing something about climate change when they're just not. And they're just looking to get votes. And they're looking to make you feel like they're serious and the right isn't. But they're no more serious than the right is on this issue.
But can I also just point out that, two things. Number one, you can have, the loveliest, most well-designed institutions at a domestic or international level. But top-down rulemaking doesn't challenge the ruling class who have a vested interest in the maintenance of the status quo and are also inordinately the people in those rooms.
I'm saying you would have to have actual coercive force. You would need a genuine commitment from those with institutional power. And if you're not going to construct institutions that are backed by real, serious, hard power to enforce these targets, then what you have is just language games. And it's language games, whether it's at the domestic or international level.
Sure. And what I'm saying is, in order for those, I think as a class, we would need to be in a position of greater structural power such that we would have meaningful influence over the nature of those institutions and the, emissaries that we were sending to them or to help craft them or whatever. Because at present, given the current balance of class forces, what we are talking about when we talk about the people who would be in those rooms and in those institutions and crafting that policy. We're talking about people whose very class position, their very existence is contingent upon upon the maintenance of the system that has put them there. And even if they're well-intentioned,
this is why people like Bernie Sanders
force.
are running, right? Because people like Bernie Sanders are running to change the people who are in those rooms. And if AOC is a socialist, like she purports to be, then she would be one of the people trying to change what goes on in those rooms. But if you're going to claim that you're a socialist and you're trying to change what's going on in those rooms, you cannot then advance a climate agenda, which is just redux of the same kinds of climate agendas that have been tried for the last several decades by liberal institutions. And so this is another example of why AOC is not really a committed socialist of any kind, because if she were a committed socialist, she would not be proposing that we do some version of what the Europeans have been doing on climate. What the Europeans have been doing on climate is nothing like remotely close to adequate if you want to offset major carbon emissions increases in places like India. The European decreases are completely wiped out by India's behavior every year. So
it's also
she's not actually committed to changing what's going on in the rooms, but she presents herself as a socialist who is. And so that's the point I'm making, the very simple point that this is one more case in which I saw some real concrete evidence that AOC doesn't understand how political change is made, isn't capable of delivering anything. And I don't think she even sees the problem. I don't think AOC is even cognizant that what she's doing isn't an adequate response to climate change. I don't think she's even fully aware that her take on race, immigration, the relationship between being Latino and being Native American isn't coherent. I don't think she even sees that when she makes that tweet about how Shapiro is somehow catcalling her. I don't think she sees how that is damaging to her favorability rating, damaging to the long-range political feasibility of her and of the movements that she is associated with. I don't think she's even aware of any of this stuff because I don't think AOC really knows what she's doing in terms of long-range political action. I think that she has a different purpose. And that's what I think you've been getting at as I've been trying to lay this stuff out, that she's got a different purpose that is to do with brand building and self-promotion. And that's what really bugs me about her.
So I'd just like to dispel this notion that AOC doesn't know what she's doing. She knows exactly what she's doing. No, I mean, here's the thing. I think that being a feckless neoliberal, to accuse someone of being a feckless neoliberal is in no way calling them cynical or unkind or insincere. It is to recognize the feckless emptiness of what passes for the political in the neoliberal era, which is an era of cosplay. Politics is purely aesthetic now, and that's the way it necessarily must be, because the prevailing ideology of our time is liberal individualism, of entrepreneurship, of attention getting, of leveraging whatever one has in a will to power, totally unprincipled way, because that's the only way you survive in a neoliberal hell world. Even if you are a middle-class person in the developed world, that doesn't make you exempt from the pernicious necessities of surviving within this system, right? None of this has anything to do with anyone being a good or bad person. I literally think that AOC is a genuinely empathetic person who would probably be quite like a really wonderful friend and would also care a great deal about her constituents and like seems really passionate, right? Like, but to me, and I think to any analysis worth making, that's basically irrelevant, right? Like, I'm sure there are plenty of Republicans who are great members of their communities and who would help you out at the Rotary Club. And, you know, yeah, like our former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, is really, really committed volunteer within his community at the Surf Lifesaving Club. He volunteers with the Royal Bushfire Service. Like, being a participatory, empathetic, contributing member of one's community and a kind, loving neighbor or friend is not the same thing as being a useful political actor for a left movement. And the longer we conflate those two things, the more disappointed we're going to be. But I also think that, like, in the absence of a rooted, broad-based left that is institutionally embedded in material ways that go beyond shared sentiments, then it's going to be really difficult to have political actors at the national stage be anything but token avatars, you know, emissaries of our affective dispositions, you know, like.
And if you think about, when you talk about rootedness, I'm reminded of how she went and talked to Ta-Nehisi Coates. And after she talked to Ta-Nehisi Coates, she did an interview, I think, with The Intercept.
This is, yeah, I get tongue-tied.
Remember that?
Yes, it was the nail in the coffin for me. Sorry, just before we proceed to that, I want to rewind a little bit because, like you, Benjamin, I do think there is something kind of nihilistic and unhelpful in jumping immediately to cynicism and mockery and like not giving a politician a chance, right? Like, even if you are skeptical as hell, I think if you're disavowing them and trashing them and throwing them under the bus and being like I'm skeptical of electoralism, like, none of that is useful, I think. And I really think that, like, we're in such a contradictory moment, and we're in such a moment where the left is totally alienated from the halls of power, such that people initiating a career in those institutions are going to be very alone, and they're going to be walking a totally unbeaten path for people with their politics. And you want to give them enough space to not just to do well and cheerlead, but like, you also want to give them enough support that they can fuck up too. Right? So I genuinely felt that, for example, there was that moment where she slipped up on late night TV in relation to Israel-Palestine. I think she said something about I can't remember exactly what she said, but she made clear that she wasn't totally au fait with the nuances of, you know, people's preferred solution in the present. That's fine. Like, that doesn't mean she's an evil wench who is fine with Zionism, right? You let her make that mistake because we are all human. We all make mistakes. Move
or the
on.
thing with Ilhan Omar, where she initially went along with the party center on that and then flipped when the left came out in defense of her. She was kind of behind the curve there. So, thing is, I'll forgive a foreign policy mistake. I'll forgive something like that. In terms of an issue position for someone who's a member of Congress who ran predominantly on trying to help their own community on domestic economic stuff, I'll forgive someone who botches a foreign policy fact because it's not like they're running for president. It's not like they're trying to get on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee or something. This is just a member of Congress from New York, and she's not expected for me to know a whole lot about foreign policy. That's okay.
And
the
so
the problem is that you try to believe in people that represent themselves and are represented as committed to a genuinely different kind of politics, and you try to give them the benefit of the doubt. And the first time they slip up, you go, "Oof, that hurts," but you hope that there will be a recovery. And the second time they slip up, you go, "Oof, that hurts," but you hope there will be a recovery. And at this point, we've been watching AOC make these little mistakes, one after another, slowly for months. And you and I are obsessive enough about politics that we've seen all of them.
So I think it's really important to give not just critical support, but straight up, like, to an extent, when someone has literally just been elected, when they haven't instituted anything politically and they're making the rounds of a bunch of talk shows, I think at that point you're not giving them critical support. You're just shutting the fuck up and giving them some breathing room, because right now they're just doing a media circuit. Who fucking cares, right? I don't think that she needed to be pounced on about whether or not she sent condolences to McCain. I don't think she needed to be pounced on about the Israel thing. Not because those issues don't matter, but because she wasn't even a political actor in that moment. She was just fucking going on talk shows and initiating herself within a fucking giant media sphere that was totally alien to her, and like whatever, she still didn't have any, she wasn't in a position to be doing anything material or political in those moments. And I'm really allergic to this like concern trolling form of left politics that I think is ultimately cynical, one that will be behind her when she's doing something popular and pounce on her when she makes minor faux pas. I think that's idiotic, because I don't feel the need to cheerlead politicians when they're just doing their fucking job, right? But I also
so the question then I'm sure the audience wants to know is, what's the difference between a minor faux pas and the kind of mistake that causes you and I to lose faith in a political actor? And I think it has something to do with a demonstration of intellectual incoherence on something that is core, on something that you really need to understand and have a firm, rooted position on if you're going to advance any kind of left politics. And a congresswoman from New York doesn't necessarily have to know a whole lot about foreign policy, doesn't necessarily have to make every correct or socially appropriate move in the case of, say, something like the McCain thing. But there are a couple of things that I expect from a congressperson who wants to be a leader in a left-wing movement. I expect some kind of consistent, rooted understanding of political economy, and I expect them to not do things that damage the ability of the political movement to grow in the middle of the country. Those are two things that are really core for me. And AOC has disappointed me in both of those areas, in demonstrating that she doesn't have a clear understanding or a clear position as to whether political rights are something that should be delineated at the group level on the basis of group recognition, or at the level of universal human rights or universal citizenship rights. She doesn't have a clear position there. She doesn't have a clear understanding of the international political economy of climate change. She decides to respond to stuff in ways that flatter her district's audience, when doing so damages her perception nationally. She's got a favorability rating now that is quite negative, where she's now in the tank by about 10 points in net favorability rating, which means there's more than 10 points worth of people who don't like AOC than who do like her nationally. This kind of stuff makes me very dubious. And the thing that was the nail in the coffin for both of us was the way that she handled this Intercept interview after she talked to Ta-Nehisi Coates, in which she just uncritically bought his narrative. She just uncritically bought his framing of America as having a politics that's primarily driven by race and not by any other issue.
Yeah, like I wasn't even aware that she'd, I shared this with you a little while later, and I think she actually engaged with Coates in the interim, because I remember you being really shocked and disappointed, I think, with the Coates thing, because that was very unambiguous for you in relation to her. And I was sort of not as surprised because of this Intercept thing that was a tiny bit earlier, right?
Maybe that's right. Maybe that's right. I don't think I saw that Intercept thing.
Yeah, because see what happened
you showed it to me.
Yeah, and so for myself, it was nothing to do with Coates. It was simply this interview, and it for me was don't get me wrong. I have no beef towards her, but it just made it very plain to me that if she's useful to a left political project, it's going to be in spite of her politics, not because of them. Because within this article, every sort of nagging reservation that I'd had that I'd put back in a box in order to allow her to sort of...
You were giving her space. You were giving her room to figure things out.
But not because
and this just made it impossible to go forward with that.
Not because I had faith in her or I wanted to believe. It's just that in a very pragmatic sense, you need to give someone a bit of space to fuck up if you ever want to achieve anything politically. But that's not the same.
Right. You can't expect anyone to be 100% of the time exactly on the same wavelength.
But this was very different to me in as much as to me, I don't see a politician as a child that I have, or like a fucking bonsai plant that I get to cultivate to my liking and prune and shape. To me, I do believe that when we're talking about adults here, and she's an adult and should be treated
older than
as
I
an
am.
adult. Yes, she should be treated as an adult because she's an adult in a position of inordinate power. And she can reiterate to you 100 times over that she was bartending last year. But guess what, guys? I grew up with one percenters, and they all bartend for a few years after high school during university. And a couple of years later, they're in the boardrooms of every investment bank that fucking rules the world, right? There's no contradiction between having worked in the service industry and going on to a position of immense power. And you don't get to disavow the position of power that you are in by citing some kind of authentic working class identity, because class for leftists isn't a free-floating signifier. It's a set of structural contradictions that influence the type of lives people are able to have. And that's not something that is just part of one's narrative that is wielded as dress-ups. And so when I read this particular interview from The Intercept, I'm just going to read the two parts that really, for me, all of the little niggling doubts and worries that I'd had, that I've been keeping in that box in my brain for the sake of, needing to do that. she just burst that motherfucker wide open, and it became very, very clear to me that that she's a liberal, and the way she conceives of the world around her and her role within it is such that she can't do what we need for her to do. So here we go. AOC was asked by Brianna Joy Gray just kind of a question about policy and the absence of it when particular narratives about a candidate's identity are deployed, and the ways in which that can potentially obscure substantive political commitments. And so the latter half of the question is, so I'm curious about you. There's a lot of talk of what litmus tests, people put a lot of different things in litmus tests. What are you looking for in an emerging 2020 candidate? What are your priorities? And bear in mind, AOC was launched to national prominence very much off the back of Sanders' incipient campaign in 2015-16. The only reason that we have any fucking idea who she is because of Sanders, right? So just bear that in mind when hearing this response. So I think that oftentimes policy and progressivism gets pitted against identity in a lot of different ways. And it just makes a mess, I think. And for me, I think it's important on one side, for the progressive side, to not ignore the power of identity. Because I know when I was running my race in the very beginning, I was running with a very strong progressive base and a very strong progressive coalition. But that alone was not enough to take me over the top. And it was when I really leaned in on this broader message and crafted a progressive message that was rooted in my life story that we were able to really capture a much wider electorate, even though my progressive message was still the same. And so, just take a breather. And so I think it's important that we don't ignore the power of identity, because it's very powerful, especially for women, especially for the rage of women right now. It is, Rebecca Traister has written about this. It's women's rage is a very potent political force, and it changes things on the right and the left. It was primarily these women back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. It was primarily these white women who was supporting the Ku Klux Klan that got all of these statues erected in the South that are being taken down today, that people think were erected around the time of the Civil War. And so it's a very potent political force on both sides of the aisle, and I think it's something that we shouldn't ignore. I think it keeps getting better. I think it's great that we have multiple female presidential candidates, so there's not the woman running and then it's oh my God. I'm so very excited about there being multiple women across that can represent different parts of the political spectrum on the left. So that's something I'm thankful for, because it means that we don't get boxed in as one belief. And so I think that's really good. I'm a horse race hater. I hate them. I'm like, don't ask me until the day before the New York primary is how I feel. But I do think that obviously maybe not obviously, but I think it's pretty obvious, what we're trying to do is frame the debate and the conversation that are going to be happening that we're going to be having in the next 2 years, regardless of what the candidate is. So I do not think, for the future of humanity and for our country to continue to prosper, that we cannot have another presidential cycle where climate change is not being asked about at almost every debate. And that includes the role of fossil fuel industries. And that includes the role of a broad spectrum of issues.
So before you go on, can I just briefly say, that sounds like Sarah Palin to me.
It is. It is.
It
Sarah
honestly
it's
does.
Trump. It's Trump. It's literally Trump.
It's incoherent in many, many places. For one, and it echoes, she says, well, identity versus larger universal issues, you don't have to make a binary between those things. And then that results in her saying things like, oh, yeah, you've got a universal human right to mobility, and it's because Latino people are descended from native people, and this is native soil. It leads to that kind of incoherence. And then you've also got this point that she makes about how, yeah, her popularity in Brooklyn blew up when she started talking about identity politics. Who knew that in a district that was 80% plus for Hillary Clinton, talking about your identity could be a winning issue? The problem is that the left has been boxed in as this urban fringe thing that only succeeds in the blue cities. And it's been boxed in by this because these candidates who come from blue cities go, well, I got Hillary Clinton people to vote for me by playing into this stuff. Well, guys, if we just try to reach out to Clinton voters and try to reach out to the kinds of people who have been voting Democratic for decades, you're not going to build any kind of broad base across the country that will give you the Senate seats, the House seats, the necessary institutional power that you would require to do anything. And then she says, oh, if we get people asking questions about climate change at the debates, that's effective. We've already been over how much that's
She's an Overton window.
And then when she's asked about the thing that, and the last thing, and we haven't really hit on this too much just yet, but I want to hit it right now, is she's asked about the presidential cycle. She says, oh, there are so many great women candidates. As we've been over every week on the show, the only left-wing candidate in the race is Bernie Sanders. So if you're going to say in response to how are you feeling about 2020, oh, I don't want to get involved in the horse race, but there are so many left-wing female candidates. She didn't say, she didn't even just mention Warren, guys. She said so many. Who are all of the female candidates? Outside of Warren, Kirsten Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar. These are people that AOC thinks are strong left-wing voices, and she's willing to put her name to that in The Intercept. And she's got no loyalty. Her political career comes out of the Bernie Sanders movement.
Yes, she does.
It comes out of Our Revolution. It comes out of the DSA and all of that stuff. She's got no loyalty to any of that.
Her project. Her project is AOC. I'm sorry.
Her project isn't our project. And this is what it conclusively proved.
So, to me, something that most people would walk straight by and would indicate almost nothing to them was it carried more weight than I can articulate in an efficient manner. But she lost me at Rebecca Traister. You know why? Rebecca Traister's brand of liberal feminism is one that propagates really, really ice-cold, gender reductionist, anti-socialist, liberal ruling class feminism. It's more, I think, pernicious than, for example, people like Roxane Gay or Amanda Marcotte, who emerge from the same circles, but are dumber and clunkier, and they show their ass often enough that people don't take them seriously. Rebecca Traister has a sufficiently waspy, sophisticated sensibility, and she knows how to behave herself online such that she has a completely absurd amount of quasi-intellectual clout among a certain type of upper to ruling class elite woman. The type of women who not just ideologically, but materially mobilize against a leftist politics. They are exactly the type of women who work overtime to marginalize the voices of any dissenting women. They work overtime to quash any kind of materialist left feminist politics. They're exactly the type of women who tried to cancel Conor Kilpatrick last year when he wrote a very anodyne, sensible article in Jacobin about how in the former actually existing socialist countries, there was a lot of institutionalized and material support for young people raising families that socialized kind of the cost of healthcare and a bunch of other, issues that we would deem feminist issues in the West. They had incredibly and potentially surprisingly very progressive approaches in those countries, and there is something to be learned from them. So, for example, you had things like universal childcare. You had women could apply, for example, for no-fault divorces decades prior to that being available in the West, and a whole bunch of other sort of substantive issues that these women have crafted their entire careers around purporting to care about. He writes an article about, hey, here are some ways in which these types of issues were substantively attended to in ways that worked, and this could be instructive for us. He was straight up that they had vitriolically attacked him for more than the better part of a month, I think, in all, for literally advocating the type of policies that they've ostensibly supported. They attacked him as a human being for a month, right? That is the type of political actor that we're talking about. And if AOC is not just not hip to that, but if she's actively reading her book, which venerates women's rage in a way that is totally essentialist, totally ahistoric, totally reflective of their bourgeois moralism, and a totally alienated liberal lean-in feminism that...
And just a political no-go. I mean, imagine telling people we're in the middle of the country that the problem is that we don't scream at each other enough, that we're not sufficiently angry and ragey, and that the way to fix our problems is to be more angry and ragey.
To be clear,
it plays to the
only
Brooklyn,
women.
Yeah.
Only women. And when we say women's rage, we don't mean MAGA women. We don't mean the rage of working class women who will be criminalized if they are raging. Most of us don't live in a world where we can just wild out, where we can venerate women's rage. The veneration of certain types of affect, dependent on the embodied gender of the person holding them, is some of the most revanchist shit. And under the social implications of the toxic ideology damages so many people every day. Within the law, there is so much regressive gender essentialism that has been shepherded into the law by advocacy groups who are made up of ideologues just like AOC that has
let's give the benefit of the doubt here. AOC may not know about all of this stuff. She may not be aware of any of that. But what she clearly is aware of is the idea that this notion that women's rage is meant to be some kind of transcendental, cathartic, all-achieving political force.
It's very
imagine
powerful.
Telling an ordinary person.
It's very powerful, especially for women, especially the rage of women right now.
Just let me talk. Imagine telling someone, an ordinary voter, that the problem in America is that we're not angry enough, and specifically that women need to be angry more. Not men, just women, and not all women, but specifically women who are of a specific political orientation. And that the problem in our discourse is that this demographic isn't angry enough and doesn't rage enough. And if it raged more, then somehow that would solve the crisis of legitimacy, the crisis of climate change, the problem that we've got Donald Trump in the White House. All of this is supposed to be solved by a particular group of people from one particular gender, which we are now drawing lines around and saying is special. That one group, if they just yell more and yell louder, they'll fix all our problems. Can you imagine thinking it's politically intelligent, even leaving aside whether you think that theory is true? Can you imagine thinking it's politically intelligent to speak that way to a national publication when you have claimed that your goal is to deal with climate change and get left-wing people elected in Kansas and Michigan? It's disingenuous to claim either she's very, very stupid politically or
we don't need to imagine it, right? We saw it 3 years ago. We saw it. Like, we've been here before.
It's just amazing to me that someone would even attempt that as a kind of politics, because it deliberately excludes over and over. Firstly, it excludes anyone who thinks that rage is kind of not very nice and not a really great way to do politics. And maybe we don't want to yell at each other. Maybe we want a little bit more understanding and a little bit more kindness and compassion. So first, let's alienate all those people. Then let's make sure that we kick out every group of people that we don't like. So only male rage is scary, so let's get rid of that. And then if you're a woman who doesn't conform to the very specific politics of this, then your rage also doesn't count.
Well, to clarify, she explicitly, like, the very next thing she says is she links white women with supporting the Ku Klux Klan. And like the other thing that made this so fucking perfect for me, this particular paragraph, you've got the Rebecca Traister, the women's rage, the white women who supported the Ku Klux Klan, that got all of these statues erected in the South. To me, that just was evocative immediately of like the surface level of her understanding of not just of history, but like of what is meaningful, like of the historical events to cite. She literally picks something of as little consequence as possible. Like a bunch of women put up a bunch of statues. That's the example she cites.
Because of the symbolism of it, because all she really cares about is symbols and language and signs. There's no material analysis.
Yes.
And there's the other bit that really bugged me from that is when she says, she was talking about white communities and their relationship to privilege and race.
Oh, it was heinous. I'm not much of a moralist, but I was incensed by this shit. And it was from then on, it was, I don't like the cut of her jib. She is antithetical to a politics that I want to have anything to do with. She is a race reductionist, gender essentialist. Like, you follow her thinking to its logical trajectories, and it leads to the most repugnant forms of racial and gender segregation and incredibly revanchist social organizing. Because if you conceive of the world that way, then the structures that currently exist are in no way conducive to human flourishing. None whatsoever. But she's
Amy, let's read it. Let's read it before we analyze it. Let's read it so the listener knows
I'm
what
just
she
getting
said.
mad. I get very tongue-tied about this because
I'll read it, okay? The solutions are so painful.
Can I read it in my Valley Girl voice?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, wait, 1 sec. I just want to find it. Solutions. Oh, okay, got it. Okay, got it. Sorry. So, Brianna Joy essentially asked her, like, how do we take any form of sort of identity politics, for lack of better expression? How do we kind of attend to that in a way that isn't just symbolic? How do we do something substantive with that, right? And so AOC, what I imagine is like, they're like, we need to, and like when they say discrimination or unfair incarceration of Black men, and then they pause and the crowd cheers, and it's like in their mind, it's like, you're welcome. Yeah, you're welcome. It's like you're acknowledging it. It's like, okay, acknowledging it. Racism is a really big step. It's a really big step from where we were. But you're right, it's nowhere near enough. And the solutions are so painful. I find the solutions for white communities to be very painful, because it's very painful for a community to understand and go through this. Like, the idea that you can be poor and benefit from the color of your skin does not compute for a lot of people. And going through that realization is very painful, or even just economically for people that were born with silver spoons. It's very painful to admit that you had advantages, and it's just, and then Ryan Grimm says, look what happened to Brett Kavanaugh when he was confronted. He melted down, ! Melted down as in like performed in a way that got him appointed. Melted down.
To the Supreme Court of the United States.
Yeah. Anyway, that's a whole other discussion. And then AOC says it literally is an identity meltdown. Ryan Grimm, I worked for everything I ever had. AOC, yeah, and like that is the majority of a lot of communities. I'm sorry, I have to interject again. Kavanaugh has existed in the most elite tier of society for the entirety of his life. He went to an elite Jesuit school in Washington growing up. His parents were, I'm pretty sure, corporate lawyers in DC.
Aimee, what's the relevance of this?
Like, no, but I'm saying the idea that like a member of the ruling class is entitled for AOC to then say, yeah, and like that is the majority of a lot of communities, how a lot of communities feel. No. Most people can't relate to the life or the feelings of Brett Kavanaugh.
That's a good point.
Like the essentialism of seeing a white person and thinking that somehow this member of the absolute ruling class who wields his power over all of us in tangible ways every single day in institutions making judgments, to say that like his experience is an avatar of that of people in the Rust Belt dying deaths of despair, whose literally their life expectancy has been declining since the year 1999. The suicide rate has done nothing but increase since the year 1999. Like, no. You are making like an utterly repugnant argument that is totally divorced from reality. If you look at this member of the ruling class, i.e. Brett Kavanaugh, and analogize all people of the same race as him, as having the same experience or set of experiences, or
and you know who
to check
wants,
their privilege.
You know who wants to do that? You know who wants
Capital.
to make that analogy work?
Capital.
The right
And
wants
the
to
right.
make it work. And the
Of
right
course.
has been trying to make that work for a long time, because if it can get ordinary white people to think that the left views them as in the same boat as Brett Kavanaugh, as people with unearned privileges that ought to be taken away, then they can convince loads and loads and loads of ordinary working class white people to vote Republican, or at minimum to not vote for Democrats or left-wing candidates, because they can say to them, see, the left thinks that you don't deserve any help. The left thinks that you're just like Brett Kavanaugh. So it's not going to help you. It's going to transfer resources to other groups of people that aren't you. And in playing into this frame, the white privilege discourse reinforces a lot of right-wing talking points and right-wing frames. And I was floored this week when you found that amazing study, which shows that this is now scientifically provable, that when you use the white privilege discourse with people, you encourage them to think in a more right-wing valence. You encourage them to think of poor white people as not entitled to any help, as not deserving of any kind of material assistance.
I mean, it's kind of like what we talked about in our terrorism episode, right? Like a keen observer with a strong theoretical grounding will articulate this stuff well before the fucking quants and empiricists get around to demonstrating it in peer-reviewed scientific studies, right? So you look at the
but
work
I'm grateful to them. I'm grateful to them because this is something we've been saying for a long time, and it's great to see that there's research that now is supporting it.
Yeah. But so the major problem with it is not just that it leans into like the right wing of a politically liberal order. But my issue with all of this is that it actually reinscribes the logic of the entirety of the order, both the progressive neoliberal side and the conservative neoliberal side. Like, this logic benefits both, because what it explicitly does is everything in its power to constantly shift the goalposts and say, look over there, in any direction, along any number of intersections and axes, so long as you are not looking at the objective, structural
the goal is to get people off political economy. That's what culture war is. Culture war is a set of issues that don't have much impact on people's lives, that don't result in much in the way of real policy, but take people's attention, take people's time, take people's money, take people's political energy away from causes to do with revising the structure of political economy.
It's neoliberal, except like depoliticization, and that would be bad enough. But it's now at the point where it's not just depoliticization, it's that the brands have now turned it into a way not just to like, it doesn't just depoliticize people, it actually like, it legitimates capital institutions in people's minds in ways that are fucking repugnant. Like,
right,
you
because
can now
the implication is that these institutions would be fair if the positions in them were occupied by people with racial or gender diversity, which reflects what is going on in the society. And it undermines the larger left-wing critique that those institutions themselves are fundamentally unacceptable, regardless of who's occupying the offices.
It's not just it replaces it for something aesthetic. It's that it gives moral licensing to things that, can you hear that?
Yeah, I can.
Noise? Okay, sorry. So it's not just that it takes our attention, like our eyes off the prize. It's that it's now at the point where it provides moral licensing for things that we should find utterly repugnant. Like last year, Nike made its biggest increase in sales off the back of the symbolism of Kaepernick as this kind of social justice oriented avatar in their advertising. And so now suddenly products that are made with complete fucking sweatshop labor in the developing world, now it is the socially just, righteous and progressive move to consume those. That's what progressive politics is now. Like that, AOC not only doesn't get why any of that's a problem, but she literally holds hands with it and skips along and whistles while we all get to, like, walk to the camps. And the other thing is, like, she's ostensibly disavowing power whilst using it. Like, the way she spoke about the power of her identity and that her identity was very powerful. You don't get to be in a position of power like that and simultaneously disavow it without anyone on the left pointing out that this is a fundamental performative contradiction and it's a nonsense. And it would be one thing if she was just doing a media grift, like doing a cultural grift, doing whatever. But she's in a position of
she's become
influence.
Associated with democratic socialism. And because she's become associated with democratic socialism, everything she does that is counterproductive, everything she does that makes it look like the left doesn't care about people who live in the middle of the country, all of this stuff weakens the left, weakens the ability of the left to compete. What has changed since 2016? The principal thing that's changed is that the Bernie Sanders movement, which was initially preponderantly winning in the primaries in rural and suburban districts, not in urban centers, has now become obsessed with the concerns of professional class yuppies living in cities. It's become obsessed with them and obsessed with the rhetoric and language that they prefer to use. And what some of these candidates, the ones who've been successful, unfortunately, have been candidates who live in these districts that are full of yuppies. And they go, I know how the left can win. The left can win by appealing to yuppies in the cities. That's what worked for me. But the bulk of the country doesn't look like that. And because the left isn't framing itself in a way that is competitive across the bulk of the country, the opportunity that Bernie Sanders created is in the process of being squandered. And meanwhile, while all these people write these nice pieces about Elizabeth Warren and screw around all over the place, concern trolling Bernie Sanders about his money or concern trolling Bernie Sanders about whether or not he uses the kind of language that these yuppies in the cities like, what's happening is that Sanders' poll numbers slip down a few more points. The little fish that pretend to be progressive and left-wing take a couple of them here and there. And who comes out ahead? Joe Biden.
But AOC does. That's what I like. She's not in this as any kind of collective or movement-oriented thing. It is
she's
an
not a political
individualist
actor.
Well, she is. She's a neoliberal individualist. And
Right, so
everything
she's
she's doing is
just
perfectly
grifting.
calibrated to her own success. No, but
Right,
like,
it's just grifting. But politically, I don't care about her personal project. I don't care about her. Politically, it's very damaging to the left to have someone who has been given this position by the bulk of the people on the left, the bulk of the podcasts on the left, the bulk of the outlets, media outlets that affiliate with the left, the bulk of the people who write and talk and organize about left-wing politics, give AOC this position as some kind of spokesperson or trailblazer or future presidential candidate. And meanwhile, she is taking every opportunity to put herself and her personal brand development ahead of that political movement because she's not interested in that political movement at all. At all. It's just a tool for her to self-promote. And that's what really bothers me about her. And if she thinks she's a political actor, if she is really a well-meaning person who's doing the best she can, she's going to hit a ceiling pretty fast because I don't think she could win governor of New York with this kind of platform, much less anything broader than that. And even if she got to a point where she was as competitive as Hillary Clinton and could win senator of New York or could run a competitive presidential race. Someone like this cannot lead a mass movement that delivers a large number of seats in the House and in the Senate. And they can't be a spokesperson, a leading spokesperson for a movement that accomplishes that. Someone like this has far too fringe a political valence. And no one is talking about this. And this is what I was getting at the end of last week's show, that she's just like Elizabeth Warren. She speaks to too narrow a group of people. And she's more interested in promoting herself in the same way that Elizabeth Warren took every opportunity to promote herself as this spokesperson for the progressive movement, while meanwhile taking concrete actions that damage that movement. Where was Elizabeth Warren when you needed an endorsement from her before the Massachusetts primary in 2016, biding her time and hoping to get a cabinet position in a Hillary Clinton administration? Has AOC endorsed Bernie Sanders this cycle? No. Will she endorse Bernie Sanders this cycle? If she does, probably only when there's no stakes to that endorsement. Because AOC is a careerist.
There's this, I think, noble, but I think ultimately mistaken setup there, in as much as like AOC absolutely and beautifully represents the quote left, end quote. And when I say represents, what I mean is like in a like an aestheticized politics of group difference. Yeah,
but as you and I have pointed out over and over again, that's not really left wing.
Yes. No, but just bear with me for like a little bit. So she represents in that sense, but she also reflects back to a lot of people the funhouse mirror distortion known as socialism today. And so when we say like she's interested in building a career for herself or whatever, like that in and of itself, I don't think is a critique, because I think anyone engaged in parliamentary politics of any kind is necessarily engaged in like a career-oriented project, right? It doesn't mean anything. Bernie has made a career for himself in politics.
But it's different. I think building a career is different from building a movement. It's different from building a movement.
But of course it is. But it's also what exists at present is an entire cohort of atomized media personalities that we have somehow conflated with some form of like left political orientation, as though they are uninvested actors. And I just think that's a category error of the worst kind. Every single podcaster and journalist and media yuppie socialite covering this stuff is engaged in, first and foremost, brand building. And she reflects back to them what their maximally liberal version of, quote, socialism is. She affirms all of their own existing liberal values, and she reminds them of them. But she also ticks a whole bunch of like moral righteousness boxes that they have on identity grounds, because their values have been totally corrupted by neoliberalism and form has displaced substance, right? So she's a woman. She's a, quote, person of color. She's, quote, of the working class, all that crap. So she reflects back to them like the consummate realization of the hollowed socialism that is not socialism. And so whilst she's building a career for herself, she also serves a very useful function for all those like media functionaries that purport like pass as some form of nascent left movement, but in fact were always already just a bunch of like social climbing, career oriented individualist. Like this is not anything with any kind of material solidarity built into it. And so she is actually, whilst building something only for herself, she's also managing to titillate the only existing form of allegedly left infrastructure, which is not left infrastructure at all. And so what that serves to do is marginalize any form of meaningful critique of her. And so it sort of posits her as this vanguard of socialism, quote, socialism, which is always already totally liberal. And it also serves
those
to
journalists
damage...
are professional class, and we know that the professional class isn't the left. We've talked about that before.
Yeah, totally. But I'm finally getting to my ultimate point, which is simply that if she was in any way serious the one area where I think she has potentially had real power is bridging what was ultimately a bullshit gap, but a gap that existed nonetheless, between the professional middle-class women just like her and the ones who have fallen in love with her incredibly quickly because she actually reflects their politics. She had very real power to bridge the gap between them and the politics of Bernie Sanders, because for more than 6 months, you've been hearing a significant contingent of those motherfuckers who, small though they may be in number, they are incredibly influential in terms of setting the tone of debate and coverage in the Democratic Party primaries. She had the power to methodically and carefully articulate to that particular set of people why my politics are Bernie's politics. If you like me, he's your guy too. Because there have been an inordinate number of those motherfuckers who will be literally blowing smoke up AOC's ass, wishing she was old enough to elect, etc., claiming that she's a democratic socialist, literally liking all of the policy proposals she makes, yet simultaneously disavowing Bernie. She's had the power for almost a year to be methodically making the case as to why she and Sanders are of a piece. And the fact that she is a young Latina woman is in no way contradictory with the democratic socialism of Sanders, the old white man. That democratic socialism is a broad tent that delivers for people of all identities. She had what I perceive to be as a huge amount of epistemic authority in the eyes of those people. And her unwillingness to wield it says to me, not only is she career-oriented, but she also just doesn't give a fuck. She doesn't share our goals. It's not just that she's daft or cynical or doesn't get it. It's that she fundamentally doesn't have the same goals as us. Because I think anyone who is on the left is unequivocal about the fact that Bernie Sanders represents a once in a generation opportunity in terms of silly presidential politics. He is qualitatively different. He's totally different than any opportunity we've had and or likely to have for quite some time. And if you have what I believe to be is a reasonable amount of epistemic authority to speak to a false divide that Hillary Clinton created between one half of the party and the other half, if you have the power to try to reconcile that divide, I think you fundamentally, if you share our politics, you will do it. And whilst I disagree with her framing on some issues, I think that for a counterexample, Brianna Joy Gray has worked overtime to use her epistemic authority as a young progressive woman of color to articulate steadfastly and unambiguously that Sanders' politics are the politics of working people of every color. And I find myself, on occasion getting frustrated even with Bree's sort of more tepid or diplomatic framing of things than we would go. But But every time I've seen her interview AOC, she's asking questions that are far too radical for AOC to even either get or endorse, right? Like Brianna's questions are ones that AOC doesn't even engage with the meat of them.
Yes, this is what I've been saying the whole hour. So why did you frame it as like it's a critique of what I'm saying? It's the same thing I've been saying.
Wait, was it that? No. Wait, where were we? I just lost my train of thought. Sorry.
That point that I made about how she doesn't support Sanders and she says that there are many progressive women in the race.
Yes, yeah.
That's what I've been saying, that she has demonstrated that she's not actually committed to this in any way.
Yes, yeah.
That this isn't what she's about. That's what I've been saying.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, well, we agree then. But I think,
so why did you pitch it as a disagreement? What did I say that you thought?
Did I pitch it as a disagreement? Okay, so for example, I don't care if Liz Warren didn't endorse Bernie in 2015. Because whilst people had some dumb ideas about her being a leftist, I think special situations create special opportunities that only some people are in a position to potentially take up that burden or responsibility or whatever. And I don't think that in a free society that we mandate things, we mandate certain people do certain things. But I do think if someone wants my respect, and certainly any kind of respect, and for them as any form of leader, you don't get to just renounce what I perceive to be as like, she had a giant amount of power to do something really meaningful that she didn't even engage with. And that to me is just, I feel like she had a special duty above and beyond that of someone like Warren. Because I
think their situation was more similar, or at least that it would have been reasonable for Warren at the time to have perceived the situation as similar.
Yes, I think so too, but I think there was a much different obligation in as much as attempting to heal the divisions that existed on false pretenses is something that you can do discursively. You can't heal the divide within the party that exists between vested interests and, whatever nascent form of grassroots type candidates that exist within the party. You can't do that just with a discursive project. But if there's been
it wouldn't have been as powerful, but she could have shored up the policy wonk credentials of that campaign, right? You had a lot of people during that race who were going after Bernie for being not policy wonky enough and who were making bad faith critiques of the policies. And Elizabeth Warren could have, during that campaign, come out for him, defended the policies, made the case in her kind of silly policy wonk way that they were great and that they were necessary. And she didn't do that. I agree that AOC's opportunity is bigger than Warren's was. It's
not just opportunity. I think it becomes an obligation. If you've been elected if you've been elected purporting to be a candidate explicitly committed to that set of political ambitions and whose very existence as a political actor is dependent upon Sanders.
Sure.
I guess what I'm saying is, so everyone knows that I have we both have a complete disdain for Elizabeth Warren. But my disdain for her is, it's a storm in a teacup compared to just the repugnance I have for AOC. And I am a moralist when it comes to her because I see her as this vanguardist for my deepest fears about the Democratic Party and the total, to me, she presages if everything that we hoped might come to pass in the moments following 2016 was just flushed down a toilet, it would be everything that AOC represents. She is the vanguard of that toilet flush in every way conceivable. She thinks that politics is telling children in Queens that they should become vegans. And at the same time, she's managing to neuter and empty whatever, apparent voice there is for a democratic socialism. It is just being pissed away on her Instagram feed and her trash the patriarchy tweets. Like, it is just so deeply disappointing to me in a way that Warren could never disappoint me because I expected nothing from her and never had any hopes in her.
I don't see all that much difference because the way I see it, Bernie Sanders has the capacity to kickstart something if he gets elected president and has the opportunity to give a lot of young left-wing people jobs in government, experience in government, networks in government. And anyone who damages that in significant ways is, I think, in roughly the same boat to me. And
okay,
AOC damages him by withholding endorsement and by framing everything in a way that's damaging to his campaign. Warren damages him not just last time in withholding the endorsement, but this time in running for president against him and in attempting to position herself to his left nominally through these policy wonk things. And by getting people who are supposed to be on Bernie's side to write nice stories about her instead of talking about him, instead of promoting him. And so we don't have what we should be having, which is the Bernie Sanders dank meme stash all over again. Where's all the Bernie content? Where's all the, hey, we need Bernie, Bernie's important? Where's all of that? Instead, it's a bunch of Elizabeth Warren came out with a policy proposal. Ooh, I like her. And instead, it's all, hey, here are the things I don't like about Joe Biden's personal life. And hey, here are the things I don't like about that Bacharach piece about whether or not Mayor Pete Buttigieg is sufficiently aesthetically LGBT.
Identity can be very powerful to me.
We're just
yes,
we're,
it
we're
is
not,
to a neoliberal. It is. It is though. It is. It's a mode by which they accumulate capital, social and otherwise. What's going to happen here?
Well, all of these people are getting in the way of Bernie Sanders running a competitive campaign and increasing the chance that he doesn't win. And if he doesn't win, then there is no chance of anybody else winning the presidency on a left ticket for a very long time, which means there's no chance of those networks developing, of people getting into government, getting government experience. And that's what you need if you want to actually take over the Democratic Party and turn it into some kind of left-wing force. You need a huge number of people with experience in government who know how the system works from the inside, involved, running for stuff, running competitive races. We need to take the left out of the fringe and get it involved in the actual practice of governing. And that isn't going to happen if Bernie Sanders loses. It's going to be right back to the wilderness. And so for me, anybody who's getting in his way for any reason, no matter how small it may appear, if you're not out for Bernie, then you are potentially condemning the left to decades of additional irrelevance. And so I don't see any real distinction in terms of their effect on politics between Elizabeth Warren and AOC. And there may be affective reasons for liking one or being more annoyed with one than the other. But politically, there is no difference. They are both withholding support from the only left-wing candidate who has any possibility of doing anything. They are both, by withholding support, implicitly endorsing the exile of the left to the fringe for another generation. And that's what really bothers me about all of it. And there's all of this aesthetic stuff to do with what so-and-so says and how so-and-so talks. And what it comes down to is I would let AOC say whatever she wants about whatever she wants if she would just endorse Sanders. And I'd let Warren say whatever she wants about whatever she wants if she would drop out of the race and endorse Sanders. And the fact that these people will not do this means that they don't care about anybody but themselves.
Yes.
Either that, or they have absolutely no understanding of the political moment and they're deeply stupid. It's one or the other.
I don't think you get yourself elected to Congress as the youngest member ever, the youngest female candidate in Congress ever, beating an incredibly powerful member of the party, like the second in command. You are not politically unsavvy to do that, to unseat him.
You can have a localized savvy. She can be good at running in that district. She can be good at knowing what people in that district like. But that doesn't make her nationally competitive. And there are some districts in this country that are gerrymandered to the point where to be competitive in those districts and to be really, really effective at mobilizing people in those districts, you are encouraged to say and do things that are career killing from a national standpoint. But I'd forgive all of that. I'd forgive it all if she would just endorse him. The fact that she doesn't endorse him means she's either not committed to a left-wing project or she's stupid.
Yes, I think it's totally binary on that front. But I don't... I think it's fairly self-evident that she's not stupid. I don't think that she's incredibly...
From that comment about immigration, that totally nonsense... mobility is a human right. And by the way, the human rights that implicitly apply to all humans come from the fact that Latinos are native people and this is native soil. That remark, listening to that Intercept interview, listening to the cadence, the way she talks, the things she says, I'm not convinced that she's intelligent. I don't think you need to be smart to win an election in the United States. I don't think you need to be smart to beat someone who's got a lot of political experience. You need a certain kind of charisma. You need a certain kind of charisma, but you can still be stupid. You can still not understand that what you're doing is counterproductive to a political movement at scale. She could have genuinely socialist intentions and just not be able to see beyond the tip of her own nose. She could.
I don't care about intentions.
But that would be stupid. That's what I mean by stupid. She can't see beyond the tip of her own nose. She can't see her role in the broader political movement. Either that or she doesn't care.
I think she cares about different things.
She might care about different things, yeah, but that's not caring about the left. That's what I'm saying. She doesn't care about the left, or
she has different
cares,
goals than
but
us.
she doesn't understand what she's doing. Really doesn't understand, and only is able to see what's immediately politically effective and not the long-term big picture ramifications of her actions. So she might be good at building a career, but terrible at building a movement. Or she might not care about building a movement at all. I'm not sure which it is. But either way, we've got a problem.
I understand what you're trying to do in terms of steel manning and not saying that, like, you don't want to call her pernicious or malevolent or disingenuous or whatever.
I just can't know that. I'm not.
You don't know it.
I don't know her intentions.
Sure, absolutely. But I think she makes this, what I perceive to be really disingenuous double move, where she embodies the thing but also denounces the thing that pisses me all the way off as a woman. In terms of, like, I think she leans into the, like, who, little old me thing whenever it's convenient. Right?
You're more bothered by hypocrisy than I am. Like, I don't really, it doesn't matter to me very much.
Let me finish a moment. I'm not bothered by hypocrisy for its own sake. What I am bothered by is someone embodying and reinscribing revanchist notions of what it is to be a woman, whilst purporting to totally disavow those, because what I think she does is re-entrench incredibly regressive narratives about women. And I think I think she's damaging I think she's damaging.
But like, that's just discursive. That's just discursive.
It is, but I'm explaining why she fucking annoys the shit out of me.
Yeah.
Like, okay, I admit it's shallow, but like, for fuck's sake, it's 2019. You don't get to like run around like, I
she reifies gender norms. She reifies racial categories. She reifies all the stuff that any self-respecting left-winger is meant to be attempting to deconstruct.
Yes, and she's exactly the type of person. She's exactly the type of person who gets any kind of creative, dissenting, actually progressive thinking of women and men on the left. She's exactly the type of condescending, scolding discourse cop who not only doesn't advance left-wing causes, but works overtime to marginalize the possibility of anyone who will. And so I see that as being exactly what she's doing in terms of Sanders too. And again, me overvaluing performative contradiction, but like affectively, I think there is something more honorable in the fact that shitty fucking Liz Warren is running against Bernie. She is his ostensible enemy, and at the very least, she's owning that in one way or another. Whereas
right, like I said, you're more bothered by hypocrisy.
I am, because of, okay, here's the difference. You remember in the early 90s when all this motherfucking triangulating was going on, and after the fact, everyone looks back, all of the shit-lived centrists look back and act all shocked and appalled and dumb about the fact that NAFTA may be not such a great idea, and everything that has happened in the intervening years and the steady rightward lurch that has occurred. They act all dumb as fuck. But there were people at the time saying it. And I feel like right now that triangulation is precisely happening between the center of the party and just a fake aestheticized version of the left that will be the exact type of thing that in 20 years we look back at and act all fucking dumb. And, you remember that when, like, it was totally neutered in, like, a whole new other way? That's, like, I feel like AOC represents the vanguard of that. So I, like, hate her for, like, the future consequences of what she's going to do in a way that, like, I just can't be bothered to get on board with Warren because she's fucking old and over. She doesn't represent, like, to me, the horizon, I don't care because she'll go away.
Right. You and I have made this same point, but we've made it in a slightly different way. You've focused on kind of how she discursively is taking people who were left-wing and who were supporting Bernie Sanders and is kind of bringing them back into liberalism. She's finding a way to take that radical impulse and reconvert it back into liberal sentiments. And you're very bothered by that at the discursive level. And
because
I'm very
of what
bothered
it presents as a risk for the future.
I made the same kind of point, but I made it a little differently because what I said is that she's turning the party into a party that only appeals to those professional class liberals in the cities.
But that's what it already is.
Right, and therefore only to their politics. But no, not just the party, but the left movement. So she's taking the left movement and turning it back into something like the Clinton movement, but with a more radical aesthetic, but which is not politically different. So what people thought AOC was doing, what I think a lot of people thought AOC was doing, was that she was taking Bernie's politics.
They still think this.
They still think this. They think that she's taking Bernie's politics and selling it to the Clintonites in the cities. When actually what she's doing is she's taking Bernie's aesthetic and using that to sell liberalism to the Bernie people. So it's the opposite of what people thought was happening. Instead of using AOC to convert Clinton people into Bernie people, we are seeing AOC convert Bernie people back into something resembling Clinton people with an updated language, updated look, updated brand. And you focused on it at the discursive level, and I was focusing on it more at the material level. But we were both making the same kind of point.
Because I think ultimately, I think the one thing that is, I think the takeaway is exactly the same between both of us. And like, I also think that I think, what am I trying to say? I think there was never an actual left. There was a nascent speck or an impulse or a potentiality, right? There was a fucking fertilized egg. And it had huge potential, but it was never in any way, shape or form guaranteed. But AOC is the person who comes along and tells you she's going to take care of it and help it hatch. But she fucking murders it whilst telling you she's still taking care of it.
Well, the one thing that gives me some hope yet is the announcement that she's going to be involved with Bernie on this piece of legislation that they're attempting to put out, which makes me think that maybe AOC will get her act together at some point and do the right thing. But I'm concerned. And I don't think that she understands or cares. One or the other, maybe both.
I think Bernie's a fucking genius, though, because the moment I looked at that, it became very clear to me that he has not only proposed something that gives her an opportunity to... This is why it's fucking genius. He gave her an opportunity to get the spotlight, which she adores. He gave her an opportunity to lean into her so-called progressive bona fides, which on the economic front, she kind of lacks, right? So you can imagine that her strategy people would have told her, this is a good move for you, right? It's a very good move for you to lean into something that focuses on consumer credit, that is actually about material improvement to people's lives. But you can also do your whole communities of color access to lines of credit shit with it as well. But what it also does, and this is why I think it's absolutely genius, is it plucks one of the few strengths that Elizabeth Warren has in terms of an actual history, in terms of actually achieving anything politically. It steals that from Warren as any form of advantage. And it also recruits AOC as a lobbyist for Bernie on the one issue where Warren potentially had an argument to make about her superiority as a candidate.
The thing that's frightening is that Bernie Sanders has to recruit AOC for this in the first place. Why didn't AOC immediately offer herself for this purpose? Why didn't she immediately look for ways to help?
Because Bernie is not powerful within the party. That's why.
Right, because she's trying to build a career and not a movement.
Yes.
So I'm just hoping that either AOC decides to reevaluate or she...
get out of the way,
nice.
bitch. As long as she's out of the way.
Nice.
As long as she stays out of the way. I'm not in this thing of we need to fucking push her or being constructively critical. AOC is not listening to any of us. She has no obligation to any of us. None of us are her constituents. We don't get to, we're not going to fucking influence her. She already thinks she's an Instagram influencer. She is going to do what she needs to do, what is useful for her. And if Bernie
I'm
can
not
make
suggesting we can
opportunities...
influence her. That's not what I'm saying.
I know. I'm saying that I have no hope for her in any way rethinking anything or being useful unless someone manages to present her with an opportunity to be useful that gets her out of the way of causing harm, whilst also presenting her with a very real opportunity for her own advancement. Because that's the only way she'll ever be useful to us is if we give her a cookie. That's all. I have no hope other than that. But if you give her a cookie to stay out of the way, then that's good.
Well, there's still a question about endorsement. AOC still potentially could endorse someone in the race, and that means she could belatedly attempt to reattach whatever she's doing to Sanders.
Which she will do if it looks like which she will do if it looks like he's going to win.
And if she waits until that point may not come. So this is where I am just quite concerned that someone like AOC may, not just in the future down the line, inherit some left-wing movement and treat it badly. If Bernie Sanders doesn't win, there's not going to be a left-wing movement with or without AOC of any substance in America for quite a while.
There is no left movement right now. There's no social base of a left politics.
Insofar as there's a left movement, it's the Bernie Sanders campaign. That's the movement.
It's an embryo. It's not even a fetus. It's not a baby, and it's certainly not a fucking child.
But it's something you and I think can do something. So let's talk. The positive agenda here is for that movement to get off the ground. And so if she snuffs it out by failing to endorse, that's going to be a real shame, because there is no left movement for AOC to inherit that is in any way actually left if Bernie Sanders doesn't win. AOC is soft enough and malleable enough and all over the place enough that if she actually got embedded in the Bernie Sanders movement and was surrounded by Bernie-crats and was talking to Bernie-crats all the time, she'd do pretty Bernie-crat stuff, and it would be fine.
Yeah, because
she's not embedded in that, and if she instead stays out of the race, or worse, hitches herself to someone else, and there have been occasions where she's specifically praised Elizabeth Warren, then the effect of all of this could be to absolutely gut what remains of the opportunity. And there is still something that remains of the opportunity. That's why we care. That's why we're talking about it. Otherwise, it would just be talking about nothing. We still think that there is some opportunity for Bernie Sanders to win. And that means there's still some opportunity for people who have not yet done stuff that is constructive to do stuff that is constructive. It may not happen, but there's some opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I just want her to stay out of the way.
I don't know if that'll be good enough.
Like, when I say stay out of the way, I mean, like, either... Like, to me, if she's to do it, like, for her to do anything that's actively useful, every single second that elapses represents the diminishing utility of her endorsement. And when I say her endorsement, I mean, like, from the moment she was fucking elected, from the moment she became, like, a fucking thought leader across the country last year. It was a ticking time, like it's been a ticking timer in terms of the amount of influence and impact she could potentially have. And so like either she endorses within like the next little while. I don't know how many months. I don't want to put a particular time frame on it, but like, in order to do something meaningful, she needs to do it early, and she needs to be just a relentless fucking warrior for him in the press.
And so far, she's preferred to stay out, say nice things about Elizabeth Warren and all the other left-wing women in the campaign, whoever those are supposed to be.
She's doing worse than that. She's actively providing, like,
cover to those candidates. She's providing ideological cover to them. Yeah. That's what she's done so far. And so it's not just that she's stayed out of the way. She's actively damaged the Sanders campaign.
She's mystified.
Because she's badly represented socialism in the public eye. And while she's been badly representing socialism in the public eye, she has been lending what support she does command to other people who are not him, and obfuscating the political stakes of the
Yeah,
election.
the key and the main fucking point of someone like Sanders running for president is not because we believe that he can enact as a lone political fucking maverick, that he can enact some radically transformative fucking socialist vision. It's that class consciousness in the United States is in a fucking toilet. And to the extent that Sanders can spend 2 massive fucking media spectacle cycles using the media to raise class consciousness, that is at present, like, that is what we expect it to do as the
And a little bit more than that, because we do expect if he were to win, he could get a lot of people jobs. And those people would make a difference in the future.
Yes. But if
he loses, right now, it's not going to matter. If he loses, none of that energy is going to matter.
No, because it already happened last time and it was not enough. But my whole thing is that the primary power she has right now is solely a discursive one. And so whilst Bernie's primary power right now is running a campaign to raise class consciousness, AOC is doing everything in her power to mystify class antagonism and confuse and not advance people's class consciousness at all. And that's
because
why
AOC herself has
her.
no consciousness. AOC herself understands nothing. And if you don't understand anything, then how are you supposed to raise anybody's anything?
Again, she doesn't need to be cynical or malicious or bad faith actor. In fact, I think she, in her own head and heart, is genuinely a very kind person. She seems really kind and really genuine. And really
as we
useless
talked about
and really
before,
damaging.
That excess of empathy, I think we talked about this on one previous episode, causes her to have a lack of rootedness. She just identifies with the feelings and sentiments politically of whoever's around her. She doesn't have a core grounded set of convictions. She just wants to help whoever's around, however they decide that help is meant to come about. And apparently she's not hanging out with enough Bernie-crats. Because if she was hanging out with enough Bernie-crats, maybe she would care about some different things. But that's inevitable. You take someone like that who's got no intellectual rootedness, you take them out of their activist campaign where they're surrounded by the lefty activist base, you stick them in D.C., you give them a D.C. staff, then you have all of these liberals inviting her on all kinds of shows, inviting her to have all these conversations with all these different people. And all of these people will be happy and they'll feel heard if she handles them in a liberal valence and uses the Hillary Clinton words and the words that the Brooklyn hipsters like to use. All of those people will socially reward her for doing that. And since she doesn't know what she thinks about anything, she's responsive to that, as most empathetic people are. Empathetic people who don't know what they believe get towed around by everybody else all the time. And that's why they end up in abusive relationships, both personal and political.
But I think it's all because
AOC is in an abusive relationship with liberalism. Liberalism is gaslighting AOC.
I'm not leaning into that at all. Sorry, I'm really allergic to that shit. Fuck that. But because again, that annoys me because it pits her as this hapless, fucking silly little lady who, gosh, didn't realize.
No, I don't think she's special in this regard. I think most people, most human beings are like this. Most human beings don't know what they're doing, and they get towed around all over the place.
I agree. But my thing is, if you want to be in a position of power, I want you to be an authentic, genuine and intelligent and a fucking strong and principled actor if I'm going to take you even remotely seriously politically. And what I see in AOC is just like weaponized trauma, like this disavowal of power whilst totally weaponizing one's own feigned fragility, like as a way to gain power. And I think to be seeing it from someone who is a member of Congress just makes me sick, because it's just so false. And for as long as she is someone who uses empathy as a guiding principle for political action, she is going to be deferring to the leadership when asked basic questions about the invasion of Latin American countries. Like, empathy cannot get you to any kind of mass or international or complicated political outcome. It can't do it. It can't operate at scale. That's not how empathy works. It's like a gut instinct that our clunky fucking brains developed as we evolved that is instinctual, and it does not work at scale because you are never surrounded. You are never able to empathize with the huge and thorny political questions that exist for a fucking planet full of 7 billion people. You naturally empathize with people who are more like you, and you will then perpetrate unjust acts in order to fulfill that empathetic sentiment that you have towards people like you. Empathy fosters tribalism, and it makes you callous, cold, calculating, and or indifferent to people who are not within your circle of empathy. And it's why I find it so repellent in a political actor, because it's ultimately a really repellent, it leads to repellent outcomes politically, such as, well, I defer to the party leadership on whether we should be fomenting a coup in Venezuela. I defer to the party leadership because you don't have a fucking spine or any set of principles. And empathy doesn't help you understand the complexity of that situation. Empathy is what Trump has when he sees one picture of one issue and is surrounded by somebody who purports to care about it. Like, empathy is the moral intuition of a child. But like, once you grow up, we need to do away with childish things and think like adults. And that's just to be a regular functional human being in the world, let alone if you want to be a fucking leader. And so this whole
empathy,
I'm just done
in
with
and of
it.
itself is okay. You just can't be doing politics primarily.
Not as a political guidance.
Empathy as something to have in your life is fine. I love empathetic people. Empathetic people are great. They're very good friends. They're very good partners. And I don't mind empathy in a politician, provided it's not the thing that makes their decisions for them about what to do and how to think about how the world works. The problem is when your substitute for having some kind of intellectual vision is your feelings. That doesn't take care of having some kind of systematized understanding of the way the world works and some kind of strategy for navigating within it politically. You can't make up for that with feelings about stuff, because feelings are too changeable. They're not consistent enough. They're too particularist. They're too hierarchical in who they tend to prioritize and who they tend to not prioritize.
They also just obfuscate the actual stakes, and they make you sit there and pontificate about your empathy for the privileged white people who are all exactly like Brett Kavanaugh. It's going to be very painful for all those shitty garbage white people to really deal with just how guilty and deplorable they really are. But I empathize with them. No. Sorry.
So don't think for a minute that we don't think that AOC is kind and empathetic. She's very kind and empathetic.
That's
to
part
a
of the problem.
fault. It's part of the problem.
Also, I'm an empathy cock fucking bag of slop in my, interpersonally. Like, I'm only, a political hard ass. Like, I have to work overtime to try to, tamp it down within myself. So it's not just like, oh, I'm just like, a dry analytical spurg who like cannot relate to sort of operating in that kind of valence. I have to work overtime to not do that because I'm committed
listeners
to...
don't know what a great friend you are.
Shut
and
up.
What a good listener you are and how kind
Shut up,
caring
dickhead.
you are.
Shut the fuck up. You know what I mean? No, I just mean like I'm a bag of slop, like in terms of the amount of empathy that I have for people, even people who are totally fucking garbage. Like I feel sorry for that Peter Solar moron because I just feel so sorry for him that he's so sad and alienated that he's like stalking everyone. Do you get what I mean? Like I just look at him like, oh, you poor lonely fuck. You poor guy, I feel so bad for you. And then I'm like, actually, Aimee, like this is turning you stupid. Like this person is doxing you. Like you don't have to fucking sit and sympathize with the devil. Like it sucks, but it's also not your problem in the moment. Like right now, your problem is that he's, like, anyway. Whatever. I'm babbling at this point. You get what I mean.
Well, since we've reached the point where that guy has come up, I'd say we've reached about the end of what's left.
It's like Godwin's law. Like, you're way over the character limit by the time you're talking about. Yeah, okay. Whatever. I'm babbling. Nothing left.
Well, hopefully that explains to you guys why I mentioned AOC, and maybe you were able to pick up from all of that why Aimee initially did not want me to talk about AOC.
Yeah, I wasn't worried about what you'd say. Just didn't want to get triggered and get us cancelled, but I've spent all week cancelled. I'm just beyond cancelled at this point, so whatever. Lean into it, hey?
Yeah, Aimee's got the blue eyes.
I'm good and mad. Sorry, for people who don't know, that's the name of Rebecca Traster's book. Anyway, sound off in the comments. We were thinking of doing at some point in the future, potentially with an expert on this particular topic. There was a whole series, like a genre, if you will, of shit-lived feminists fantasizing about women's rage that took the publishing industry by storm over the past 18 months, the Traster book being among them. We are thinking of potentially doing a reading series where we kind of engage with some of the arguments that those books were making and sort of fit them within a broader critique. So yeah, sound off in the comments if you would like to hear something along that line in future. What else? What else is left, Benjamin?
We were thinking about doing a Q&A episode at some point. So if you've got questions for us, if you ask those, we may at some point elect to answer them, provided that they're actually good questions.
Yeah, or if they trigger me, because as you can see, that always gets the content
You can always get
flowing.
Aimee rolling.
Just trigger the shit out of me. And then deprive me of sleep, and then I'll take 12 minutes to say something I would ordinarily say in one. Like right now. Adam, can you please cut this? I am babbling. Okay, so yeah, I think that's about all from us. As always, if you would like to reach out to us on social media, we're on Twitter at whatisleftpod, Gmail at whatisleftpod@gmail.com. And as always, if you would like to support us in more tangible ways, we are on Patreon at patreon.com/whatsleft. And you will be able to access our B-side each week, our second episode each week, and all of the previous bonus material. But I believe that from us is all that's left. Bye.
Bye.
Even though know people, they try to characterize my district as far left, and oh my God, every socialist in America lives in like East Bronx and Queens or whatever. But there are a lot of Trump voting pockets of my district. And I talked to these folks, and I'll never forget, and there are parts of my district that look like the middle of the country, believe it or not. And I'll never forget this one older woman who came to me and said, I always voted Democrat because growing up, my dad told me that Democrats are the people that fight for the working man. And we stopped. And the working man and woman and people is the majority of this country. And so what I think we saw was now both parties, frankly, abdicated their responsibility. And it was just no one was fighting for working people who were struggling.